In 2024, the Australia Institute's bringing some of the world's greatest thinkers to Australia to help celebrate our 30th anniversary. We're delighted to announce that Jose Ramos Horta, President of Timor-Leste and Nobel Peace Laureate, will be our guest in October. President Ramos Horta will be speaking at the Sydney Opera House on Tuesday the 8th of October at 6 p.m, 25 years on from Timor-Leste's historic vote for independence. Tickets are on sale now from the Sydney Opera House or via the link in the episode description.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows. I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics and policy in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and in the words of the United Nations Secretary General, we are in a global climate meltdown.
Extreme temperatures, raging fires, droughts, and epic floods are not natural disasters. They are human disasters.
The choices we make today will determine our future for decades to come.
The continent's seeing 346,000 wildfire hotspots this year, according to Brazil's space agency, the highest number on record.
The Amazon is starting to go from being a sink, which means on average is taking carbon out of the system, to a source. It's putting even more carbon into the system. That's really quite alarming.
Look, the UN Secretary General and climate scientists have been making it clear for a long time that serious action on climate means no new coal mines, no new gas projects.
And we must finally flip the script on a crazy situation. We continue to reward polluters to wreck our planet.
Nobody's saying close down every mine tomorrow or this week. What we're saying is stop starting new ones that are going to run into the 2060s.
Despite the global environmental crisis, this week, Australia's Environment Minister approved the expansion of not one, not two, but 3 coal mines. This decision will extend the life of these coal projects out into the 2060s and makes a mockery of the government's stated commitment to climate action. As we've so often seen in Australian climate policy, for each step forward, governments seem to insist on taking several steps back. Last week, I was lucky enough to speak to George Monbiot, acclaimed author, Guardian columnist, and environmental campaigner who joined us from the UK. He's spent much of his career chronicling the climate crisis and making sense of the forces driving it. He joined me and Australia Institute Climate and Energy Director Polly Hemming in front of 1,500 people on a live Australia Institute webinar on Thursday the 19th of September. We discussed the insidious effect of neoliberalism on our climate, the folly of carbon offsets, and why incrementalism in environmental campaigning is never going to create systemic change. It was a discussion that left me hopeful that change could be just around the corner, even if sometimes it feels bloody miles away. I hope you enjoy.
Thanks very much, Eb, and thank you to everyone for joining us this evening, especially George for making time for us down in the colonies. It's very much appreciated. So I'm just going to step back a bit and give some context for your context. And what I'm talking about with Australia can be applied globally. So even though I'm talking about Australia, this is universal. As you said, Australia's environment is officially poor and deteriorating. Our greenhouse gas emissions are increasing, land clearing is increasing, Australian governments are still subsidising and approving fossil fuels and native forest logging. We're the world's 13th largest economy, and we're a country that is happy to spend $300 billion on nuclear submarines that no one ever asked for. But the rhetoric from our leaders, despite being such a wealthy country and still doing harm, is that, well, basically it's boohoo. It's very sad that our ecosystems and life support systems are collapsing. But it's really sorry the government can't afford to protect the environment, guys. So we're going to need the private sector to step in. And that's fine. But what has been proposed is not making industry pay for the damage it does or regulating or stopping the damage it does. which are both pretty effective ideas. It's this idea that by creating incredibly complex and made-up environmental markets and financial instruments, the private sector will want to voluntarily invest in the protection of the environment because there's some profit to be made. So fundamentally, it's the same principle of neoliberalism that we see elsewhere in Australian and global policy: marketisation, privatisation, profit maximisation to the environment. And we've already had environmental markets that have failed. Privatisation more broadly has had disastrous consequences. Yet despite the repeated social, environmental and economic failures of neoliberalism to efficiently deliver public services or care for our community, governments globally are doubling down on this concept. So having said all that, the first question I would like to ask you, George, is, does the Australian context surprise you at all? And what do you think the chances are that Green Wall Street will crash?
Thank you. Excellent question. And thank you for that really brilliant introduction, which actually introduces some of the key themes of what I was hoping we would discuss. One of those first key themes is the creation of markets. You know, this whole story we're told is that there's this natural law called the free market. This is the way things are. This is the way they've always been. It just organically springs into being. But as we see very clearly with this case, it doesn't organically spring into being. It's created deliberately, and a new set of property rights is established. And then you say, right, this set of property rights is going to be called a market, and it's a free market, and people can do what they want in it. But of course, you can't. You know, if you are the Aboriginal owners of the land, and you say, we assert rights to all the nature here and to the natural resources, someone comes along and say, well, no, actually, that's my property because the Australian government has established that it's my property. So, you know, it's very far from being free, even though they have created what appears to be a market. And, you know, finance is the answer. What was the question? Seems to be the determining feature of our times. Now, of course, the moment you create a market, you create a lobby. And that lobby then tries to ensure that the market pours money into its own pockets rather than anybody else's pockets. And the lobby is the determining feature of what we call democratic politics. It's corporate power, oligarchic power, tends to exercise far more control over governments than the electorate does. And this is massively enhanced by something that Peter, my co-author, and I call the pollution paradox. And it's a really important thing, I think, to get your head around, because it explains so much of what goes wrong in our politics and indeed in our relationship with the living world. And the pollution paradox operates as follows: that the dirtiest, the most damaging, the most antisocial, the most dangerous corporations and commercial interests have the greatest interest in investing in politics, because if they don't pour money into politics, they will get regulated out of existence because people hate them. And in any democratic system, we would say, we don't want these people trashing our lives and trashing the living planet. So they're the ones who absolutely shove money into the pockets of politicians, either corruptly or above the table through political funding, campaign finance. And as a result of that, politics comes to be dominated by the dirtiest, the most damaging, the most antisocial and dangerous corporations and commercial interests. So we end up with the worst possible people in charge. And now, as we see, to come back to the theme of your question, the development of these so-called markets in nature and the valuation of nature, putting a price on what are now called natural assets or natural capital, to make this even worse, which is in fact a total contradiction in terms. There can be no such thing as natural capital. By definition, it is fundamentally wrong. We're going to see all the worst aspects of capitalism applied to the supposed task of saving the living world from the environmental collapse caused by, oh yes, capitalism. And as you both suggested in your introduction, it's going to be all carrot and no stick. You know, there are ways in which we can absolutely protect the living world, but they involve regulation. They involve containing corporate power, containing oligarchic power, stymieing the attempts of capital to turn natural wealth into pounds, shillings, and pence, or dollars and cents. But what we're seeing instead of that regulation is the exact opposite. We're handing over the whole caboodle to capital and turning the living world into dollars and cents as a supposed solution to that very problem. You extend the scale of the problem in the name of solving it. And why do you do that? Because you have a finance lobby which says we need to expand the capitalist frontier. You know, capital dies unless its frontier keeps expanding. Where can we expand it into? Oh, yes, we can expand it into nature.
Off the back of that, neoliberalism makes us feel like we are free. That's what it does. It says, you know, we shouldn't have all these horrible regulations. You've got choice as consumers. You're free. So our expectations of government have dropped so dramatically, and we think that's a good thing that governments are not ruling our lives. I'm generalising. Of course, democracy thrives on high expectations. At the same time, our guilt over not doing enough is higher than ever, and it doesn't matter how many keep cups we buy as, you know, exercising our rights as consumers, problems aren't being fixed. Is this a fundamental design feature of neoliberalism, making us feel free, but ultimately making us impotent, I suppose, to do anything?
Thank you. I think you put your finger on something really important here, which is the use of the word freedom. It's very interesting, actually, seeing Kamala Harris's campaign trying to reclaim the term freedom from the Republicans, which is clearly a deliberate ploy. Now, I'm not saying that they're by any means Kamala Harris and the Democrats are a riposte to neoliberalism. They're not really, but at least they are trying to engage with this idea that the term freedom has been stolen from us. It's been completely corrupted by the uses to which neoliberals and Republicans and others, Liberal Party and others, have put it. As the great philosopher of the last century, E.H. Tawney, pointed out, freedom for the pike is death to the minnow, which I guess in Australian terms would translate into freedom for the kingfish is death to the baitfish. The same freedom can be liberating for some people at the expense of other people. So, for instance, if you say, we're going to free you from the regulations governing pollution, and society is now free from these regulations, what that means is that the polluters are free to impose pollution on the rest of us. Or we're going to free corporations from the curse of trade unions. And you say, oh, that's wonderful. We're all going to be free from trade unions. But of course, what that means is that the bosses are free to exploit the workers. So the bosses get freedom, the workers suffer for that. And we have constantly to interrogate this word freedom, which is used against us as a weapon. You know, we all want freedom. We want to be liberated from oppressive forces, but it's the oppressive forces that have been liberated through neoliberalism. They've been liberated to exploit us. That's the whole damn point of the doctrine. But because their use of the term freedom is so seldom challenged, and there's this assumption that freedom for the boss is freedom for the worker, that freedom for the polluter is freedom for the polluted. This lazy assumption pushed out, or it's not even lazy, it's deliberate in many cases, pushed out by the Murdoch media and the rest of the billionaire press, that we have almost become used to this idea that we should accept the billionaires' freedom rather than our own freedoms. And it's our democratic freedoms which they are seeking to take from us in order that they should be free. We cannot be free unless we capture and contain the oligarchs and the corporations, unless they are in chains. And we must chain them through democratically mediated regulation. We must chain them through effective taxation. We must chain them through a whole series of controls that people like John Maynard Keynes understood were absolutely fundamental to running a fair economy that have been forgotten since then.
A future without fossil fuel is certain. A fair and fast transition is not. That is in your hands, the fossil fuel industry continues to pocket massive profits and subsidies, while everyday people bear the costs of climate catastrophe, from rising insurance premiums to lost livelihoods. Polluters must pay.
Yeah, I don't know if you're aware, Australia is one of the world's largest fossil fuel exporters. We're also the world's fourth largest carbon offset developer. Australia issues around 20 million carbon offsets a year. By just after 2030, we will be the world's largest carbon offset developer, 45 million offsets a year. Land-based carbon offsetting is Australia's only climate policy. None of them are real, but they're easy to move around in an Excel spreadsheet. You've been talking about the multifaceted problems with carbon offsets for years, and it's not entirely unrelated to what you were just saying. Why are offsets not dead yet?
Offsets aren't dead because capital does very nicely out of offsets. It creates a problem and then it sells you the solution. And it, you create a new market. I mean, it's not that capital created, government created the market. As always, this thing called the market, this supposedly free market, is absolutely a political construct. And it's also a scientific construct. It's a construct in that it doesn't have a scientific basis, but it's discussed as if it does. So what we can say about offsets is that producing carbon pollution through burning fossil fuels or through livestock, those are the two primary sources, or through several other of the activities that we do, is a dead cert. When you burn a ton of oil, you produce a certain amount of carbon dioxide. When you burn a ton of coal, you produce a certain amount of carbon dioxide. When you graze a herd of cattle, you produce a certain amount of methane and nitrous oxide. Those are absolute certainties. That is solid science. A leads to B. It's very, very simple. Carbon offsets are at best, completely uncertain. We might be able to retire this amount of carbon and it might stay in the ground or stay in the tree or stay in the cooking stove offset or whatever it is that you've done for a certain amount of time. And it might equate in 20 years to the equivalent of what we are doing today. Well, there's two fundamental and obvious problems with that. Number one, what we do today is far more important than what happens tomorrow. We're in an emergency, and if you don't deal with the emergency right now, then it becomes too late very quickly. And even if you get everything right in 20, 30, 40 years, we could already have passed key planetary tipping points. So offsetting into the future is not exchanging like for like. It's exchanging a certainty of destruction against a possibility of salvation which may not come to pass in time. Number two, so many of these offsets fall apart. Even as they're issued, at the moment you look at them hard, you say, that's not going to fly. So, for instance, what seemed to be the most obvious and easy offset of all, which was forest conservation or reforestation, and you think that is surely the set of offsets which is easiest to document, easiest to show additionality, easiest to show continuity. It turns out that a huge tranche of those offsets are basically fraudulent, that they simply don't do what they claim to do. If there is carbon sequestration, in many cases it's already been reversed, that in many cases they're selling what was already happening as if it were new and additional to what would have happened in that utterly theoretical, conjectural future of this might stay the same, this might not stay the same. I mean, what you're selling is always very hard to pin down. And in many cases, it's just not there at all. The offset gets sold, people make themselves rich in doing so, but nothing actually happens to retire any greenhouse gases. And that's the best case. The forest side of it is the easiest thing to document. We're now moving on to soil carbon in a big way. And boy, everyone's going mad for soil carbon credits. This is South Sea bubble territory. This is absolute madness. You can sequester carbon for the long term in saturated soils, waterlogged soils, in other words. Peat, fundamentally, is what we're talking about. Soil in marshes, freshwater marshes, saltwater marshes, is not an absolute certainty because global heating can turn those carbon sinks into carbon sources, and they can start outgassing methane and carbon dioxide. But at least in principle, peat and other water-saturated soils can accumulate carbon. You just cannot do it reliably in an aerated soil. And what they're trying to sell us again and again is carbon sequestration in agricultural soil. Agricultural soils are aerated. They cannot keep accumulating carbon. It does not work like that because that carbon gets oxidized. Bacteria break it down. Even the most complex and supposedly stable humic acid molecules can be broken down by bacteria. You can accumulate carbon one year, it gets broken down the next year and it's gone. Moreover, we can't even accurately measure soil volume or soil bulk density at the moment. So we haven't even got a baseline for how much carbon is in the soil in the first place, let alone having the accurate tools to measure any increments of carbon year on year. And yet this is a big new frontier in selling carbon offsets. There's hundreds of millions of dollars flying around the world now buying offsets in aerated soils. It's total fraud from the very outset. But the carbon emissions from these polluting industries which are buying the offsets, those are real.
This must be what people feel like when they go to church and they feel salvation. Thank you. Would you be okay with us? Well, would you give us the rights to making a George Monbiot doll that would pull a cord on its back? It says, is this the quote? Offsets are the certainty of destruction versus the possibility of salvation. This is absolute madness. We can.
Sadly, I think the major market for that doll would be people wanting to buy it to stick pins in it.
Still buying it. Still a market. Conceiving of really big, bold changes and asking for big, bold changes can be hard if you think that you're a lone voice. You were saying earlier that you don't win many friends, I suppose, having big ideas, and the media is not very keen on covering things that are not, I suppose, the status quo. Again, that's a feature, not a design flaw of neoliberalism. There's this sense of despair and buying keep cups and carbon neutral petrol, which we sell in Australia, it's certified by the government. That's only feeding that sense of despair because nothing's changing. Can you talk about modern instances where people have made change and how that happened to show that it is actually possible? We're coming up to a federal election and there's very much the sense that we pick the party that is less bad than the other major party.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like strongly to endorse what you say about the media. I mean, the media is, with a very few exceptions, our enemy. It really is. It's up there with fossil fuel companies, up there with the mining conglomerates as being like a gun pointed at the head of humanity, because what it does is to provide the social license which those damaging corporations need to operate, constantly pouring out justifications for planetary destruction, justifications for injustice, justifications for inhumanity. It's just constantly telling us that up is down and 2 + 2 = whatever they want it to be. This has been the frontier for neoliberalism and the frontier for all other forms of deception of the public on a massive scale. And it's not just the Murdoch empire, horrendous as that is, the evil empire run by the Murdoch family. Here in the UK, the BBC is absolutely up to its neck in it. It just mouths neoliberal platitudes day in, day out. And there's no room for people like me on the BBC at all anymore, because we're dangerous. We work against the grain of capital, and therefore we have to be shut up. And this whole talk of freedom has been accompanied by the extreme censorship of all those with dissenting views. And so, we find ourselves in a difficult situation, but that's not the same as saying it's an impossible situation. And many people in other societies face and have faced far worse. We see dissidents even in totalitarian regimes whose lives are constantly threatened by their dissent, which, is not in any way the case for someone like me. I can live a perfectly safe and comfortable life. I can just get bloody frustrated with the environment in which I try to work as a journalist, but that's not in any way to say that my life is at risk. But what was it? Last year, 200 environmental defenders in different parts of the world were murdered. And the courage, the solidarity, the coming together of people in the face of these threats is a constant inspiration. This is the thing which motivates me, which keeps me going, which gives me hope, is seeing what people are prepared to do to defend themselves, defend their communities, defend the living planet. And, despite these 200 people being murdered last year, still their communities are fighting those battles. Still people around the world who could be killed at any moment for trying to defend their land, their natural wealth. Still they are standing up to these immensely powerful forces of capital. And sometimes the weak people turn out to be more powerful than the powerful people, because that example, that inspiration which they deliver through that courage, through showing that they are prepared to sacrifice their lives, that can and does change the world. But of course, we need a system. What we need to do is to produce systemic change. And one of the great failings of mainstream environmental campaigning, and indeed mainstream political campaigning, progressive political campaigning throughout the neoliberal era, has been a lack of ambition. It's been cowardice, effectively. I'm not in any way talking about those frontline environmental defenders. Those are the brave people. But the big environmental NGOs, we don't want to scare people. We don't want to get in trouble with the charity commissioners. We don't want to lose any membership. We don't want to alienate anyone. So we won't ask for very much. And maybe if we have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, one day all those little incremental changes will add up to systemic change. Bollocks. That's not how it happens. The plural of incremental change is not systemic change. The plural of incremental change is failure, right? And always, when we're trying to get these little changes, or let's move to cotton buds which have paper stems, not plastic ones. Let's recycle our bottle tops. I'm not saying it's a bad thing to do. That's not going to take you anywhere. While we're doing all that stuff, the other side, first the neoliberals, now the radical right, they have pursued systemic change and they have achieved it. They've changed everything. They've turned us all into neoliberals. They've changed the human psyche. Everything has changed. While we're saying, we're not sure people are ready for change. There's extraordinary nonsense. So what we've got to do, first of all, is decide what we actually want. And if you ask a lot of the big environmental NGOs, or indeed political parties, political campaigns, what do you actually want? They say, a little bit less of that. That's not a political program. It's a few modifications of neoliberalism. Sorry, no, that is never going to take you anywhere. All that does is to play into the hands of your opponents. What we need is different systems, different economic systems, different political systems. And that's what Peter and I have tried to do in the book, drawing on brilliant work of other people. Never, ever are you alone in this. You're always standing on the shoulders of giants. You're always making use of other people's work, of synthesizing it, of trying to pluck good ideas from here and good ideas from there and bringing them together into what could look like a system of change. And that's what we're trying to do. We've seen some fantastic examples of how political and economic systems can change. And so, one of the ones which inspires me most is what happened in the Brazilian city of Porto Alegre between 1989 and roughly 2004, a period of about 15 years. And during that period, that city was run by its people. It had been one of the most corrupt cities in Brazil, effectively run by a mafia. The council was totally in the hands of sort of powerful local oligarchs. You'd issue contracts to build an unnecessary bridge to your brother-in-law or to your mate in the local cartel, and all the money was wasted. As a result, Porto Alegre was at the bottom of the Human Development Index for large cities in Brazil. A new municipal government came in the Partido de los Trabajadores, the PT, and they said, we're going to do things completely differently. We're going to put the budget in the hands of the people. You, the citizens, are going to decide how the money is spent. And everyone said, well, that's ridiculous. What do they know? Half the citizens of this city are illiterate. How can they possibly create a budget? And they're going to make the stupidest decisions. Oh my God, they're going to build all these unnecessary bridges, and they're going to give contracts. Oh no, wait a minute, that's what the last lot did. Anyway, so they did this, and they said, right, not only are you going to decide the budget, you're going to decide the process by which this budgeting happens. This was radical stuff. You're going to hand all this over to the people. I mean, that's kind of democracy. That's terribly dangerous. You can't do that. People are idiots. And the most extraordinary thing happened, because the amazing thing about participatory democracy is that it works better in practice than it does in theory. You can always come up with 100 reasons why it's not going to work, but when it does work, what it does is it transforms the people who engage with it. It turns them into democratic citizens, and they engage seriously and deeply, and they take on this burden of responsibility with enthusiasm. You'd think no one would want to turn up. How boring is that? Setting the municipal budget. 50,000 people a year turned up at these meetings to set the budget. And the highest representation was in the poorest areas, because they could see that this was going to make the biggest difference to their lives. And within a remarkably short period of time, they completely turned that city around. Massive improvements in maternal mortality rates, infant mortality rates, primary healthcare, primary education, sanitation, sewerage, public transport, right across the board. Porto Alegre came out as #1 on the Human Development Index for large cities in Brazil. It was a complete transformation, and the people turned into democratic citizens. Now, eventually it got stifled when the forces of capital swept back in. Since 2004, it's gradually been sat on until it's more or less gone away. But there is a model there, a model we can build on, a model that should inspire us all over the world. Why can't we set our own municipal budget? Why can't we set our own national budgets? Why can't we build on systems, for instance, put forward by Murray Bookchin, with this system where you build your politics from the ground up? Your primary political unit is the local borough, the local village, the neighborhood, effectively, and then you delegate decisions upwards rather than downwards. There's brilliant examples in Taiwan, in Barcelona, in Madrid, in Paris, doubtless. Oh, Melbourne. Yes, Melbourne, of course, is one of the places. I mean, it could go much, much further, but one of the places where participatory democracy has been given a little bit of scope. But it should be, I think, the primary form of social organization. I'm not suggesting sweeping away representative democracy completely. I think it still has some functions, but at the moment, we delegate all our powers to remote authority. Once every 4 or 5 years, we put a cross on a piece of paper, and then we are deemed to consent to everything the winning party does for the next 4 or 5 years. We don't accept the principle of presumed consent in sex. Why should we accept it in politics? But that's what the whole political system is based on, presumed consent, because more people gave across to this party than to other parties. We then have a mandate to do whatever the heck we want that we can get through Parliament for the next 5 years. That's not democracy. That's a mockery, a caricature of democracy. We could do it so much better.
And that's where we'll leave this episode of Follow the Money. I want to thank so much George Monbiot for joining us. The discussion was recorded on Thursday, the 19th of September, and some things may have changed since recording. And just a reminder that Jose Ramos Horta, President of Timor-Leste and Nobel Peace Laureate, will be visiting Australia as a guest of the Institute in October. He'll be speaking at the Sydney Opera House on Tuesday, the 8th of October, and tickets are just $19.50 and they're on sale now from the Sydney Opera House. You'll find all the details on their website or in the link in the episode description. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show today, and you can reach out to us via email at podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ebony Bennett. Thanks for listening.